You've heard of gold. You've heard of silver. But what if I told you there was once a metal so rare that even king's men who ruled continents died without ever seeing it? A metal whispered about in secret laboratories, guarded by monks in hidden monasteries, and blamed for driving alchemists to madness. Tonight, I'll tell you the forgotten history of the metal humanity chased for 2,000 years and never truly found. Welcome, this is the story of orichalcum, the treasure that refused to exist. Chapter 1. If you lived in a small European village around the year 1100, there was one sound you would hear long before the roosters crowed. It wasn't the clanging of church bells or the rumbling of wagon wheels. It was the steady, rhythmic creaking of wood against water, the turn of a water wheel. You might imagine medieval life as loud with warfare and heroic clashes. But the true rhythm of civilization was not set by swords. It was set by gears, paddles, and flowing streams. While kings issued decrees and knights polished armor, it was the humble watermill, a device so simple that its motion resembled breathing, that quietly enabled towns to grow, fields to expand, bread to rise, and people to live longer lives with slightly less suffering before the water wheel. Grinding grain was one of the most exhausting and time-consuming tasks a person could do. Every household needed flour, and every bit of flour required force applied by hand. Women, more often than not, spent hours hunched over querns, two heavy stones stacked atop each other, with grain poured into the top and ground by rotating the upper stone manually. A single family needed several pounds of flour per day. Turning a quern could take hours, leaving arms aching and backs strained. You could not choose not to grind grain. If you didn't, you didn't eat. It was that simple, but what if that burden could be shifted? What if something else could turn the stones? Medieval people weren't ignorant of natural forces. They observed wind, water, and weight. They watched rivers move rocks, saw branches sway without effort. And so, at some unknown moment, long before history bothered to write it down, someone placed a plank of wood into a flowing stream and noticed the river would push it. The river didn't get tired. It didn't complain. It didn't ask for bread or rest. It would turn that plank forever, as long as the water flowed. And so arose the vertical water wheel, a circle of paddles attached to a central beam, catching the current like cupped hands. Early versions likely spun slowly, clumsily, leaking energy in every direction. But soon carpenters and blacksmiths refined the construction. Oak beams fitted with iron nails, paddles angled just right to catch the force. From paddle to axle, from axle to gear, from gear to millstone. And just like that, the river was grinding grain for villagers. This was as close to magic as anything they had seen. You, as a medieval villager, might wake before dawn carrying a sack of barley or wheat across your back. Instead of crouching alone in your hut, sweating over stones, you would walk to the communal mill. It stood at the river's edge like a guardian of motion, its wheels spinning steadily, splashing arcs of water in the air. Inside, the sound of grinding was constant but calm, like a deep mechanical breathing. You would hand your sack to the miller, a figure both respected and resented. Millers were crucial, but often distrusted. They handled what everyone needed, food, and they took a portion as payment. This mulcher, usually 1/16 of the grain, was their fee. Some millers skimmed more than their share. Many were accused of greed. So much so that proverbs emerged across Europe warning, "A miller's soul is hard to weigh. Too much dust makes it float." Yet no one could deny their importance. Without the miller, no wheel turned. Without the wheel, life was harder. But the water wheel wasn't just for flour. Grain was only the beginning. Soon, blacksmiths realized they could harness the same motion to lift hammers. Cloth makers used it to pound fabric in fulling mills. Woodworkers used it to saw planks in sawmills. Even paper, by the 13th century, was crushed and pulped using water-driven mechanisms. Every strike of the hammer, every press of the cloth, every slice of timber came not from sore arms, but from the silent agreement between humanity and water. The landscape began to change. Rivers once left wild now had channels carved, diverted, dammed. Not for beauty, for power. Wooden sluices controlled the speed of the current. Mill ponds were dug to ensure year-round supply. The more mills a town had, the more prosperous it became. Taxes were levied per wheel. Kings granted rights to build mills like they granted titles of nobility. The water wheel became so essential that in some places, owning a private hand mill was considered illegal. Lords knew, if peasants could grind their own grain, they wouldn't pay to use the lord's mill. So laws were written. Bread could not be baked unless the flour passed through the official mill. Resistance happened, of course. Some families kept small querns hidden beneath beds or buried behind barns. Archaeologists still find these forbidden stones, worn smooth by secret hands. To grind illegally was not just petty theft. In some regions it was treason, power. Once measured in men and animals was now measured in water. Cities that had once consumed labor like firewood could now build faster, feed more people, produce more goods. The wheel didn't get tired. It didn't revolt. It didn't ask for food or coin. It simply spun. But let's ask a quiet question now, one that medieval people likely didn't. But we can. What happens when a village becomes dependent on a river's flow? What happens when one invention, designed to save time, becomes so critical that without it, the entire system collapses? For as the wheel brought ease, it also brought reliance. So before we move forward, pause for a moment and picture it. You are standing beside the river at dusk. The wheel is still turning. The air smells of wet moss and crushed grain. Behind you, smoke rises from hearths. A child laughs. Somewhere a donkey brays. Life is easier now than it was for your grandmother. But is it safer? Are you more free or simply bound to a new master, one made of wood and water? Chapter 2. The wheel that divided villages and built empires. The water wheel did more than grind grain. It restructured society. It is easy, from the vantage of modern comfort, to imagine technological progress as universally welcomed. But in the medieval world, efficiency was not just a gift. It was a disruption. It redistributed wealth, recast authority, and introduced new forms of dependence. The water wheel was, in its simplest form, a rotating beam of wood. But in economic terms, it was a monopoly machine. To operate a mill, you needed access to a river, and access to a river was usually controlled by someone powerful. A peasant could make a handquern out of stone, but he could not carve a dam into a riverbank without permission. So mill ownership was rarely in the hands of ordinary people. It was controlled by lords, monasteries, abbeys, dukes, and kings. Monks, in particular, became master millwrights. Walk through almost any medieval monastery, and beneath the silence of prayer, you would find the hum of industry. Monastic rivers were redirected through channels, powering not one but several mills in sequence: grain mill, fulling mill, hammer mill, even fish ponds with carefully regulated water levels. The Cistercians, an order known for strict discipline, were also known for engineering brilliance. They built entire hydraulic systems across Europe, some so advanced that later engineers studied them centuries after. To the monks, water was not just power, it was a rhythm of devotion. They compared the constant turning of the wheel to the constancy of prayer. Water gave without tiring, as God commanded man to labor without complaint. But villagers outside the monastery walls might have seen things differently. If your village stood beside a river, but the monks controlled the nearest mill, your labor still passed through their hands. Your bread was blessed and taxed by men who did not plow your fields. Feudal lords, too, saw the value of enforced dependency. across France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire. Documents survive detailing banalites, exclusive rights claimed by lords. These included banal ovens, banal presses, and above all, banal mills. Under these laws, peasants were forbidden to bake bread in private ovens or grind grain in private mills. They were required, under penalty of fine or confiscation, to use the lord's facilities and pay for it. To grind your own wheat at home was considered theft of the lord's rightful income. It did not matter that the wheel was powered by nature. Legally, the motion of water was owned by hierarchy. There are recorded incidents of mill riots, though medieval chroniclers rarely dignified them with detail. In the margins of dusty manorial accounts, you sometimes find brief lines like, "Mill damaged by locals," or "millstones cast into river by unknown hands." These were the quiet rebellions of those who understood that when one tool becomes essential and controlled by few, it is no longer a tool, it is a chain. And yet, for all the tension it caused, the water wheel also brought prosperity. Where a mill stood, trade followed. A village with a mill could feed more people. Craftsmen settled near mills for easy access to processed goods. Bakers opened shops. Brewers brewed ale from malted grain. Markets formed around flour sales. Towns that once barely supported 30 households grew to hundreds. In England alone, historians estimate that by the 11th century, there were already over 6,000 mills, nearly one for every 50 households. By the 13th century, that number had doubled. Mills were so common that travelers described landscapes not by terrain, but by sound, the continuous groaning of stones that marked each settlement. But the water wheel brought a second revolution, one not of food, but of material. Imagine a blacksmith before mechanization. His arm must lift a heavy hammer again and again to shape red-hot iron. Each strike draws strength from muscle and breath. To smelt, forge, and refine even a single tool is laborious. But attach that hammer to a camshaft powered by water. Suddenly, ironwork could be produced not by strength, but by flow. What once took an hour might be done in minutes. The water-powered forge reshaped warfare and agriculture alike. Plowshares could be produced faster. Nails could be made in abundance. Horseshoes no longer required a smith to exhaust himself over each one. Let us not forget fulling mills. Cloth, the medieval equivalent of both warmth and wealth, required processing after weaving. Woolen cloth had to be pounded in water with clay to remove oils. Before mills, this pounding was done by trampling with feet or beating with paddles. But a water wheel could lift and drop wooden hammers without end. Cloth could be cleaned and thickened en masse. Textiles expanded. Trade grew. Commerce quickened. The wheel spun, and with it, society accelerated. But acceleration brings imbalance. As mills became symbols of authority, they also became symbols of inequality. In regions where water access was controlled by elites, poorer villages were left grinding grain by hand long after their neighbors mechanized. In dry regions, windmills emerged, but wind was less reliable. The north of Europe flourished with wet rivers. The south lagged behind. The wheel, in its turning, drew a line across the continent between those who had consistent mechanical power and those who did not. Still, there was one thing no miller, no monk, no king could prevent. Water wheels brought people together. The mill was one of the few places in a village where nearly everyone, men, women, and sometimes even children, gathered regularly. Grain had to be brought. Flour had to be collected. Disputes had to be handled. Gossip flowed like water. Deals were made. Matches were arranged. News traveled first through rivers, not carried by messages, but spoken across sacks of grain. Millers themselves became unofficial diplomats. They saw everyone. They heard everything. They knew whose harvest was weak, whose cattle had died, whose family had grown. And though many accused them of dishonesty, many also relied on their discretion. More than one love affair, more than one secret arrangement, was shielded beneath the gentle scrape of stone on stone. Now consider this. What happens when a machine becomes not just part of work, but part of life? When its presence is so constant that people no longer remember life without it? The medieval water wheel did not announce itself as an invention. It slid quietly into culture and rooted itself. No chronicler celebrated its arrival. No king gave a speech declaring the age of mills. And yet, without it, kings would have lacked food for their armies. Monks would have lacked supplies for their libraries. Merchants would have lacked goods for their caravans. But technology, once embedded deep enough, becomes invisible. Here is a question to hold on to. When a tool becomes so essential that people stop noticing it, does it still belong to those who built it, or does it become something else entirely? Chapter 3. The last furnace still burns. No one knew when humanity stopped seeking orichalcum and simply accepted its absence as fact. Perhaps it faded from ambition the moment gunpowder and iron cannons came into fashion. Nobles no longer craved strange metals from myth. They craved things that won wars. And orichalcum could not be melted into cannon shot. But not everyone forgot, hidden away in a mountain range between France and Italy, in a monastery so remote that even bandits ignored it, lived an order of monks who claimed their predecessors had once served as metallurgists for Emperor Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor. These monks swore that they possessed a secret. They had never stopped trying to forge orichalcum. A traveler named Matteo Rossi, a wandering scholar from Genoa, wrote of visiting them in 1521. His journal described the approach. The path wound like a serpent through cloud and snow, and no bird sang above it. At the summit, a stone arch waited with no guardian, and beyond it, the smell of burning coal, though no smoke marked the sky. The monastery was quiet, almost abandoned. But deep within, beyond prayer halls and libraries stacked with crumbling parchment, lay a room no monk spoke of aloud. The door was of iron, melted smooth as though cast in a single pour. Inside, a furnace that had never grown cold. The monks tended it in shifts, 3 at a time, in silence. There were no prayers, no hymns, only labor. They ground metals into powder, measured liquids with glass droppers, stirred molten mixtures with iron rods engraved in old Greek letters. Matteo stood watching for hours before one of the silent brothers approached him. Instead of words, the monk pressed something into Matteo's hand. A thin sliver of metal, not gold, not copper, but glowing, faintly, as though lit from beneath the surface. Matteo wrote, "It was warm as breath, though I had not touched flame. When I tilted it against the light, it shone not yellow nor red, but like every sunrise reflected in water." I asked what it was. The monk simply bowed. He was not permitted to keep it. The sliver was taken back with cautious reverence, as though the smallest fragment could shift the world if mishandled. Matteo left the monastery that evening with more questions than answers. Others tried to confirm his story. Some said Matteo was fooled by clever fakery. Others whispered that the Vatican sent agents to retrieve the furnace's contents and sealed them in vaults beneath Rome. Even today, among metallurgists and historians of esoteric science, there are rumors of electrum alloys that shouldn't glow but do. Of coins found in ancient shipwrecks that pulse faintly under moonlight before turning dull again. Of a steel blade recovered from a forgotten tomb in Armenia that refuses to rust. Even after centuries exposed to air, none of these findings are verified. Not officially, but then, those who truly possess orichalcum would never announce it. Legends persist that somewhere beneath the sands of Tunisia, inside the drowned ruins of Carthage, lies a sealed vault bearing the sigil of a sun rising between twin dolphins, the royal crest of the last orichalcum king. Divers have searched for centuries. None have found it, or perhaps they have and simply chosen not to share. Imagine for a moment, A metal so radiant it glows without fuel. So unbreakable it cannot be bent by hammers. So stable it resists time. Kingdoms fell in its pursuit. Cities burned. Scholars went blind. Monks tended a furnace for 800 years without rest. And yet, no emperor ever held it in his hand and called it his. That is the legacy of orichalcum, not as a treasure to be owned, but as a reminder, some things were never meant for crowns. If you made it all the way to the end of this sleepy little journey, thank you. I hope it helped you relax, or at least distracted your mind long enough to drift off. I make more quiet history stories just like this one. So if you'd like to fall asleep to forgotten kings, strange inventions, and mildly important events that barely mattered, you're in the right place. Before you go, please tap like and subscribe to Quiet Boring Sleep. It helps more tired people find their way here. Sleep well, friend. Until the next story.